my fellow bass anglers, back for part 4 of the top 5 baits of the fall season series. Last video we talked about underspins, and this video we're kind of going to build off that. It's a bait that you can throw in very similar areas to an underspin. It'll catch some of those same fish, but it definitely has potential, I would say, for a bigger fish, to fire up schools of bass. And it's a really important tool that I've added in the past few years, that can catch some really good fish this time of year and all the way through the winter season. So without further ado, we've got the Alabama rig. Unfortunately, I don't have any clips of me catching fish on it yet, since I just started filming a couple months ago, and I haven't really gotten on that bite yet, but I'm sure it's kicking off, and that bait's gonna come into play real soon. So yeah, the Alabama rig is basically imitating a school of bait fish. It's got all these wires, but it's really pretty simple. It's just yeah, imitating a school of bait fish. You got jig heads and you got swim baits, and it's pretty much the best bait that we have as bass anglers to imitate a school of fish and to trigger that feeding response in those bass. So it's a really fun bait. It obviously has more than one hook, so you can catch multiple fish at the same time, and it also just has that drawing power to get those bigger fish that might not react to one single bait, but they see a school of 6-7 shad swimming by. It just gets their attention. So it's a really fun bait to throw. I like to use it in a lot of those areas that I like to throw the underspin, like I said. Definitely in some of those pockets where there's bait fish being corralled, some steep rocky banks. I've caught fish on like deep rock piles, just slow rolling that thing on the bottom. You can cast it out to suspended fish if you're marking fish suspended, or you have live scope and you can see them on live scope. That's a great bait for that. I've caught them on deep docks, like fish will suspend out on the edge of some docks, especially out on Clear Lake, and they'll kind of just use that as an ambush place. As bait balls swim by, they'll kind of just dart out and feed. So yeah, there's a million places you can throw A-rigs. I've even caught them over grass, deeper grass, like 15 to 20 feet, just low rolling that thing over the grass and popping it. If I feel it getting hung up a little bit, I caught some nice solid 5+ pound fish doing that. So there's, yeah, endless areas you can throw this thing. Anywhere that you find bait and you find bass, I would give it a shot. It doesn't excel too much in shallow water. I would say probably 10 foot or deeper is where you want to throw it, but you definitely can adjust the weight a little bit to get away with throwing it in some shallower water. I think it's just more of a deeper water technique, just because it's pretty big and it can be kind of heavy depending on the jig heads that you're using. So some of the baits that I like to throw, it's all swim baits. So kind of my go-to, as I talked about in the last video, is the Keitech Swing Impact Fat. Generally, for the baits that have hooks on, in California you can have 3 hooks. So I'm running 3 hooks, and then on most of my rigs there's 3 dummy baits. So these don't have hooks on there, they're just on screw locks. And so it's just adding to that school of bait profile. But if a fish eats these baits, they're not going to get hooked. But for the most part, the bass are going to attack the baits that are lower down and further back. And so if you look at most rigs, they'll have the shorter wires towards the top, and that's where you put your smaller swim baits, and then you put your hooked baits on the 3 wires to the bottom. And usually I run a slightly bigger swim bait on that, so I'll run anything from like a 3.8 to a 4.8 on the bottom on the hooked baits, and then on the top I'll run anything from like a 2.8 Keitech to a 3.3 is probably where I would stop. But you definitely want to have those smaller baits for your teasers, and I'll even just use some other swim baits just to kind of change up the vibration for the teasers. But yeah, definitely the Keitechs are a good one. Some of the colors I like: Gizzard Shad, TW Pro Blue, Electric Shad, probably my favorite color. It's got some purple and some green flake in there. The Storm Largo Shad is a good one. This bait's a little fatter, so it has a little bit more of a profile, but it doesn't have as aggressive of a tail kick. So as that water's cooling, that bait can be really good. And another one that I've been experimenting with is the OSP Dolive Shad. This one has like a really small tail compared to the Keitech and even the Largo Shad, and so that's a super unaggressive tail kick, super subtle, and that might get you a couple extra bites in some situations where those fish might not want a bunch of action. And so those are some of the baits, some of the actual A-rigs that I like to throw. For the most part, I throw the Hog Farmer, the Tactical Bassin Flex Rigs. These are like, it's a little bit of a thinner wire, so you can see it kind of folds up. It's not super stiff wire. And so what this allows is when you're reeling that bait, and I like every probably 5 to 10 handle turns, I like to do like 2 fast reel turns, and that'll get that bait, that A-rig it'll kind of open up and then it'll come back together when you do that fast reel turn. And it kind of looks like a bait ball getting spooked and like spreading out and then coming back together. If you've ever seen shad, when they get spooked, yeah, they'll kind of scatter and then they get back in formation. And so you're kind of imitating that when you do that reel twitch. And that, a lot of times, that's always the trigger. Like every time that I do that, that's usually when I get my bite, because they'll be tracking that thing, they'll be swimming right behind it. As soon as you do that, they think the bait's trying to get away, and that's when they attack. So definitely make sure you're adding in some cadence changes and not just a straight retrieve. You can definitely get bites doing the straight retrieve. I've had plenty of them, but for the most part, it's when I do something different, when I change up that cadence, is when those fish are gonna bite. So make sure you're not just straight reeling it every time. So yeah, the Hog Farmer, the Flex Rig, it comes with no blades or with the blades. Both work. It really just depends on how aggressive the fish are. I think if they're in a feeding mood, the blades, I would go with the blades. It seems to get them a little more fired up. Just imitating even more small bait fish in the school. But if the water's really clear, those fish are a little finicky, I would say go with the no blades. Yeah, you just get a little bit of extra vibration and flash, similar to that underspin when you throw the blades, but they don't always want that. So have both ready to go. Maybe if you have 2 rods, you can throw a rig on, have both tied up, and just experiment. I usually start out with the blades, and then if they're not biting it, I'll switch it up. Yeah. And then some of the heads that I like to use, for the most part, I'm throwing 1/8 ounce heads. These are the Dirty Jigs tackle, Matt Allen Swimbait heads. Those are a good one. It's a pretty thick gauge hook. but they also make a finesse head. So if you're throwing a smaller A-rig and maybe you're targeting spotted bass or smaller largemouth, you can go with the finesse heads. I just like these because usually when I'm throwing an A-rig, I'm targeting bigger fish and I don't want to worry about bending out hooks. So that's a great jig head. It's got a nice little wire keeper on there. And I think they just came out with a new head that has a screw keeper, so it will hold your swim baits on even better. There's also the Picasso. They make a solid jig head. Whatever swim bait head you like to throw, there's a ton of brands out there. Revenge, VMC, doesn't matter too much, but just making sure you've got a strong enough hook for the fish that you're targeting. And then the weight of the jig heads is really important. So for the most part, I'm throwing 1/8 ounce, and that'll usually anywhere from like 10 to 20, 25 feet. The 1/8 ounce heads is heavy enough. Anywhere past like 20 feet, if you're fishing 25, 30, I would say go up to maybe 1/4 ounce heads. And generally, when I'm gonna add weight, I'll add it to this center bait. So it kind of helps the rig balance. If you add like the weight to one of the sides, your rig's gonna want to roll over. It's not gonna swim straight. So say it's just taking super long to sink, you can't keep it on the bottom, you want to add a little bit of weight, so you take that 1/8 ounce head off, put on a 1/4 ounce or maybe a 3/8 ounce, and that'll help get your rig down a little faster and keep it as you're slow rolling it on bottom. And yeah, as I mentioned that, I didn't really talk about how I'm fishing that. So usually I'm casting it out, sinking it down all the way to the bottom, so watching my line until it goes slack, and then I'll give it a couple pops just to get it like a foot or so off the bottom, and then just slow rolling that thing. And you want to just feel it ticking the bottom every so often. You can pop it up, just keep it slow rolling, and then give those real twitches every like 5 to 10 handle turns to get those fish, trigger those fish into biting. And for the most part, that's the retrieve that I'm going to do. That's what's worked for me. But if you're targeting suspended fish, definitely you don't want to be casting or letting it sink all the way to the bottom. You kind of count it down to that depth that you're seeing fish in. So if they're 10 feet down and 20 feet, just count it down, 1, 2, 3, until your target depth, and then start that retrieve, and kind of a steady retrieve to keep it level in your strike zone. Just being mindful of not reeling too fast, because that rig will want to rise up, not reeling too slow, because that'll cause it to sink out and you'll get hung up a lot. These things aren't cheap and they definitely get hung up, so finding that sweet spot of that retrieve that's fast enough that you're not just dragging bottom and getting stuck all the time, but also you're not reeling too fast and having that rig just playing all the way up to the surface. So that happy medium is really important. Yeah, pretty much all the swim baits I'm throwing in shad colors. Yeah, Gizzard shad. If you're in some stain water, you could throw like just a flat white, or I know for spotted bass they like that chartreuse, so sometimes like a lime ice or something like that can be a good color to throw on those rigs. And you can also change, you don't have to change all the bait colors. You could throw like all the same color on 5 of the baits, and then that middle bait you could throw just a brighter color and see if that triggers the fish. And just having that one bait stand out sometimes can get those fish to bite. So you can always experiment. You've got lots of room, lots of heads. You can even play with the dummies and just see what the fish respond to. In terms of rods, The rod I like is actually one of my punch rods. This is the Ritual Angling Jared Lintner series, 711 heavy. So it's like a moderate fast. Got a lot of backbone, but it's got a soft tip. So it makes it easy to sling those rigs out there. They're kind of awkward to cast. So having a good soft tip is important in whatever rod you choose. And then obviously when you're setting the hook, you need that backbone, so having something with a little bit of beef to it, for sure, you're gonna need that. And sometimes you'll hook 2 or 3 fish on one rig, and so being able to really drive those hooks and not be overpowered by the bait or overpowered if you have a few fish on at one time. So I like that 711 heavy. It does the job. And then I think a 200 size reel is good enough for me. I'm not throwing any giant like chandelier rigs with 8 hooks and 15 dummies. Like there's some insanely massive Alabama rigs out there or umbrella rigs out there. But for the most part, I'm throwing these six wires, 3 baits, and they're not, it's probably like 1 ounce to 2 ounces total. So it's not super heavy. So I throw Curado K 200, and that doesn't seem like it's being overpowered by the rig. But if you feel like you're gonna be throwing a heavier rig, you could go up to like a 300 size reel. The 300 Shimano Tranx is a good one. I did throw my rig on that for a while, but it was just a little too much. I don't think it was really necessary, so I went down to the 200, and it's just a lot more comfortable for me. And then my line, I like throwing 20-pound test, so either Sunline FC Sniper, that same line that I'm always throwing, or Seaguar and Vizex is a good line also. 20 pound once again. Just something strong but with some good castability, because those long casts, you want to make sure you're making as long of a cast as possible and keeping that bait in the strike zone. So strong line, but also some good casting line. You don't want to go cheap. Some line that's going to just coil up on you and cause problems. And yeah, you backlash with the A-rig and it's sitting on the bottom, you're just more likely to get stuck. So I like to make sure I got quality line, fresh line, and switch it out every few months. Just make sure it's good to go and not going to break off on a big fish. So yeah, I don't know if there's anything else for me to add. Like I said, just experiment with your baits, experiment with the blades versus the non-bladed. Switch up your head sizes depending on water depth. And yeah, maybe mess around with that middle bait with weight and color. If you're gonna switch up, make sure that's the first one you try out, and then you can just adjust from there. If you put chartreuse swim bait on the middle and they start eating that one specifically, then you can switch up all your swim baits to that color. But yeah, Alabama rig, it's a great tool. It's the best way to imitate a school of shad, and it gets bites for sure. It gets big bites. So if you haven't thrown one, check them out. Pick one up, throw it this time of year. That bite's gonna get going real soon. I know people are already catching them on it. I've been throwing it a little bit, haven't had too much success, but I'm gonna keep throwing it, and y'all are gonna see some footage real soon. So that's bait number 4, and we're finally to the end. Number 5 coming next, so stay tuned for that. Appreciate y'all rocking with me on this new series. So we'll be wrapping up the fall top 5, and then we'll move into our top 5 for the winter, because that's quickly approaching. It's definitely getting cold, and those water temps are dropping into the 50s out here. So we're gonna be switching up some of our presentations here pretty soon. So stay tuned for that, and I'll catch you on the next video. Peace.